Um, let me start by praying for us and for our time again, and then I'll just hop right in. So Lord, I pray that tonight would be an opportunity for us together as a community of faith to encourage each other and to be reminded of the ways that you have given us to help pass the faith on to our kids. And so I ask, Lord, that my words would be clear tonight and that your Spirit would be present amongst us. And that you would be our encouragement. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so my wife, Wendy, is right here. There we go. Wendy and I have been married for 26 years. Is that correct? I know the date of our anniversary. I forget how many years it's been. So I want to put up a picture here. It's actually rare that we have any family pictures, but this is my family. We have Wendy right down here. On the far left is Addie, and then over here is Greta. Addie and Greta are twins. They're 19 years old. They're both away at college right now. Addie's at Biola University in LA, basically, and Greta's at Taylor University in Indiana. So they spent the first 18 years of their lives sharing a bedroom, and then went off to college, and now they're getting to share a room that's bigger than their bedroom with a different roommate. And actually, we think it's been great for their relationship to not just take each other for granted and realize they kind of like each other, which wasn't always true for all their years of growing up. And then right here is Clara Jane. She's our youngest. She's 15 years old, and she's a sophomore in high school. And I'll talk a little bit about Clara later, but Clara has a rare genetic disorder called GAND, which is a neurological disorder which affects kind of her global development altogether. And so Clara is our special needs little girl who had completely transformed our family's lives when she came into it, and is the most work and the biggest blessing to us and our church family. And one of the things I like to say is, I mean, we look pretty good in this picture. I don't want to boast, but we look pretty good. But this is like, right here is what happened for us to be able to take a picture. We've got the camera set up on the tripod. Clara doesn't cooperate, but she likes hats. And so here you can see I have thrown the hat. There it is right there. And I didn't time it very well. So I just like to remind families, look, I just put up a really nice picture of ourselves, because who wants me to put up like the worst picture that's ever been taken? But we're a family just like you guys. And so I grew up in Southern California. I have lived in Colorado for almost 30 years now, which is where I met Wendy. And so that's home now. So I know that life in Denver is probably different than life in Leota. But what I think is common is the stages of development our kids go through, how hard it is to love your spouse well and forgive them and see the best in them, how hard it is to raise your kids. And sometimes it looks really pretty, and sometimes it's kind of messy. And so I wanted to show this at the front end, and just one, so you can see who my family is, but two, just remind you, like, yeah, we look okay sometimes, but we're a mess sometimes also, because that's just what it looks like to try and raise kids. Okay, so I asked you guys to answer these questions, and I'd love to just know, if you had a chance to do this, for the most influential people in your lives, just by raise your hands, how many of those was one of those people was someone in your family, your immediate family? Okay, that's a lot of you. How about a extended family, maybe an aunt or uncle or grandma or grandpa or something like that? Okay. How about a peer? So a friend that was kind of your age. How many of you that was maybe a youth worker or a kids worker or somebody at the church? Okay. Am I missing any categories here? Those are all like the big categories. The reason I wanted to ask you this right off the bat was, one, to cause you to think about who are those people that actually impacted my faith. And if we had time and I could go around and have you each share about one of those people that was really impactful, it would probably be really encouraging to hear how the Lord used lots of different types of people to impact who you are. Yeah.
A Christian brother.
Say that again?
A Christian brother. Oh, we were the only two Christians in the state of Pennsylvania.
Wow.
We worked for the USDA.
Uh-huh.
And it was amazing how we brought us together.
Yeah. So you never know who it is. You said a Christian brother in government working the FDA with you? USDA, sorry. Really different. How the Lord can bring somebody alongside of you that's actually going to encourage you in your faith. I'm going to come back to that. Biggest hopes for your kids. Can you guys just maybe raise your hand, shout out what some of your biggest hopes might be?
That they would walk with Jesus all the days of their life.
That they would walk with Jesus all the days. Did you even look at my notes? That they would walk with Jesus all the days of their lives. What are some other hopes? Come on, I'm not gonna like shame you. There's not like, I mean, I guess there could be a wrong answer, but I'm guessing you're not gonna say it. Yeah.
They will marry a Christian.
Yeah, that they'll marry a Christian. Great. What are some other hopes?
That my grandkids will stand up for Christ, and people will see by their lives that they are different.
Yeah, that your grandkids will stand up for Christ and they'll actually look different than the world around them. Right? Okay, how about one or two more?
That I can teach them to learn something on their own without being taught, like the ability to learn something.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Find something you're passionate for. And
yeah, the hope that you would instill in them a desire to learn and grow and like actually go after something, like that they would actually be able to do that. That's great. I love that. Yeah, one more. Yeah.
I think one that I think about is that they'll also raise their children in the church with the church family to love and serve Jesus.
Yeah.
Which I know the first step in that is
No, that's awesome.
showing our own children.
Yeah, that there's a generational, like, not just that your kids might walk with Jesus, but that they would have kids someday that would also walk with Jesus, be connected to the church and be connected to each other. Well, I think we all have, so I would say we all have spoken and unspoken hopes for our kids. And sometimes the unspoken ones are those things that we wish for, and maybe we're even afraid to talk with our spouse about or whatever, and when they let us down, that can be really hard. And then we have those things that we speak out loud and we say, like, this is what I'm really hoping for. And some of those hopes are life-altering. I mean, so you're going to hear me say, like, my whole ministry and my hopes for my kids were that they would walk with Jesus every day of their lives. That like, it wouldn't just be like, hey, youth group kids I work with, hey, it'd be great if you just made it through high school and looked really awesome, but then after that, it's not my job anymore. But actually, my goal is to do everything I can so that you never know a day apart from Jesus' love for you, and that actually transforms all of who you are. And I think if that is our hope for our kids, it actually then bleeds over into lots of our other hopes, which could be like, I want them to actually look different in their lives. I want them to actually discover their passions and how God's created them to live those out. And so that's really my hope for tonight, is for us to talk a little bit about what does it look like to really be strategic as much as we can to bring about the things we hope most for our kids. So what I was going to say is sometimes some of our hopes are like, man, I hope they get a really great job, or I hope they get a full ride scholarship to college, or I hope, someday they make a lot of money. And those hopes are good also, but often those hopes can override the deeper hope of, I want to see my kids follow God's will for their life wherever He calls them, and to be faithful to that. And it's one thing to want that, it's another thing to say, I want that, and I'm actually going to aim towards that. Because if not, what you're going to aim towards is the path of least resistance and the chance for your kids to be as successful as possible the way the world defines them. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's my hope for tonight. I want to start with just a little story about a good father that I heard about. I remember the early days of email when people would send encouraging stories all the time. Some called them spam. I just thought they were nice little stories. So this one probably came from my mom. I found it on my computer. It was a story she read about a man named Bob, who was a really great father. I just wanted to read it to you. I thought it might be a good way to kind of get us in the gear of parenting. So the email said this: being the father of 5 boys, this is from Bob's, being the father of 5 boys, I believe I've earned the right to toot my own horn once in a while. I feel my impact over the years has definitely paid off, with the result being several well-behaved young men. It blows me away when we go out and see other children behaving in a rude or disruptive manner. We've had some rough times, but I've learned that having a gentle and understanding spirit is something that most fathers do not have. I found that taking a nice quiet drive in the country to talk things over when your child isn't responding in an appropriate manner works wonders. In the coming weeks, I will share some of my strategies and proven techniques for producing happy, productive, and well-balanced, well-behaved children. Here's a picture of our son Nicholas that I think epitomizes why my method of being a gentle and understanding father really does work. Okay, so there's Nicholas. This guy's a really great parent. And then followed by this was an email from his wife that said this: yep, Bob's little drives out in the country seem to help things quite a bit. All right, it's a dumb story, but I think sometimes, right, parenting's hard work, and often, like, we're looking for someone that's just like has all the answers, or we see people have all the answers and we're skeptical because we're like, yeah, right, there's no way that your family's that perfect. And I think often this is like a peek behind the scenes. Okay, obviously this was like early Photoshop too. This kid was not going 99 miles an hour. Okay, so tonight, the stuff that we're going to be talking about is just based off of this book. It's called Handing Down the Faith. It's research done in 2014 and 2015 by a guy named Christian Smith and Amy Andrzejczyk. And basically what they did is they studied the religious traditions of a bunch of different religions. So it wasn't just Christians. It was a bunch of different religions and a bunch of different places around the country. So southern, big cities, rural, all over the place. And they just did a big study on how does the faith get passed from generation to generation. And when I read this, I found it to be really helpful as we look at the data of what does it look like for people from all different walks of life in all different places. How do they effectively pass the faith on to their kids? And the things that came out of this and that I want to talk about tonight are this. Number 1, the importance of parents. Number 2, the different parenting styles that they found as they were doing this research. Number 3, the role of parents' religiosity, how religious parents were. Verbally communicating the faith, what it looked like for parents to actually talk about the faith with their kids. And then the role of the church, how does the church play in this? And so we're going to look at these 5 different things. And what I want to start with is the importance of parents. They say this in the book: yet all research in the United States today shows clearly that parents are by far the most important factor influencing their children's religion, not only as youth, but also as after they leave home. Parents define for their children the role that religious faith and practice ought to play in life, whether important or not. Parents set a glass ceiling of religious commitment above which their children rarely rise. Parental religious investment and involvement is in almost all cases the necessary and even sometimes sufficient condition for children's religious investment and involvement. Okay, so let me just break these 2 things down. Number 1, study after study after study, so not just this one, but tons of other studies have all found that the single most important person or people in a kid's life is their parents. And sometimes you might think, okay, I get that that's true when they're like up till age like 5, but have you been around a 13-year-old before? You really think that they want to hear anything that I have to say? Does anybody have teenagers out here? Okay, right. Yeah, they're not always the most responsive. I mean, my teenagers at least weren't. Wendy and I have said that raising teenagers was probably the most exhausting thing we've ever had to do in our lives. And I've been a youth pastor for 21 years at one place and been working with kids for probably 30 years. And having young kids is physically exhausting. I mean, like I don't want to say that having teenagers is physically exhausting the same way young kids is, but the emotional exhaustion that comes from having teenagers on your roof is really great. And yet, there's nobody that has a bigger influence on your kids than you do. Period. Study after study after study shows that. And by the way, that's for good and bad, right? We like to say we're trying to put aside money for our kids' counseling fund, like all of them are going to need it at some point. And when it comes to your kids' faith, what they found in this study, and I think is true, is at some level, your kids are following your faith. So they talk about a glass ceiling, like, man, if you like show up at church maybe once a month when it's convenient, and church is the only time you ever talk about faith or ever have that really impact you at all, but you really expect your kids to go beyond that, well, the science on that actually is not very encouraging. So what I do need to say about this is, how many of you grew up in a either nominally believing or non-believing family? Okay, so obviously, if that was you, then there were other people the Lord brought into your life that actually spoke truth and brought you into His family. And so the point of this isn't to say like, Lord never uses anybody, or if you don't grow up in a Christian home, then you're pretty much screwed. The point is to say, parents, nobody has a bigger influence on your kids than you. And even when you don't think you have an influence on them, you do. And again, secular studies will show, even on kids thinking about important issues on drinking, drugs, dating, all these maybe political issues, all those different things, often their values are going to align with what the values of their parents are, especially if their parents are healthy. Okay. All empirical data tell us that for intergenerational religious transmission today, so passing the faith from generation to generation, the key agents are parents, not clergy or other religious professionals. The key location is the home, not religious congregations. And the key mechanisms of socialization are the formation of ordinary life practices and identities, not programs, preaching, or formal rites of passage. So Ren, Stephen, Andrew, sorry, church don't really have a role here. No, of course it's not saying that, but what it is saying is, look, your kids spend more time in your home than they'll spend anywhere else in their life. And so the things that happen in your home, the ordinary, everyday things that happen in your home, are the things that are imprinting who your kids are going to become. And so I don't know what it's like here. I know that sometimes in Denver, at different points, the attitude among parents has been, okay, we went to church as kids, now we're married, and now we're having kids too, and that was good for us, so we want our kids to, have that good influence. So we'll just drop them off at church so the youth pastor can fix them and teach them all the things about the Bible, and then they can come home and we'll just keep living how we've always lived. Now, it's obvious why that's a problem, right? But often that is the way that we think about things. So maybe that's like too black and white of a picture, but sometimes I think that the picture can be, well, Stephen went to seminary, Andrew went to seminary, so I don't know the things they know. And yet the Lord has actually called you to be the primary spiritual developers of your kids. Now Stephen and Andrew and Ren and myself, obviously I have a job that I love and think is important, so it doesn't mean we have no place in this. But if at home you aren't actually living out your faith in real ways, it's going to be hard to expect that that's going to all of a sudden change just because they come to church once a week or twice a week. Are you guys tracking with me here? Okay. The reason why I think this is so important is often what people get really excited about is like, oh, I've got this new rite of passage program we can do at church. Or, oh, I've got this new preaching. If we just preached on this for a month, then that would change everything. And what I want to say is, no, actually, it all begins in your home. And at churches where you have the people that you're actually living this out with, that can encourage you in that. And it's a place where you can be reminded of the truth of the gospel week after week after week. And so I'll get to the church at the end because I actually think it's really, really, really important. But what I want to say is, I think actually the Lord's equipped you to be the primary spiritual influence on your kids. It wasn't a mistake that He brought your kids into your family. And if we need people to all have theological educations to raise kids who love Jesus, who then raise kids who love Jesus, then we're in trouble. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about maybe how parenting styles maybe build into kids being able to receive the truths of the gospel and the truths of faith. So, actually, before I put this up, there's a guy that did a study of parenting all in Minneapolis, I think, of like 10,000 parents, and basically he looked at how they all parented, and then he made a quadrant and mapped it in 4 different categories. So I'll show you that graph in just a second. And came up with these 4 kind of main categories of parenting. Now, does this encapsulate everything? No, it doesn't, but I think it actually does a really good job of hitting kind of the major ways that we look at parenting. And so these are the 4 categories they came up with. Number 1, authoritarian. Number 2, authoritative. Number 3, permissive. And number 4, neglectful or uninvolved. So let me just take a few minutes and I'll just briefly walk you through what each of these parenting styles involves. So the first is this, authoritarian. Now, authoritarian parents are demanding, rigid, and strict, expecting their children to obey their orders. They are not very receptive to two-way discussions, are less likely to adjust rules and standards according to their child's needs, and are not very emotionally warm and expressive with their children. So I thought maybe it'd be helpful to just give maybe one example of what each of these parenting styles could look like around the issues of dating. So let's say you decide in your house your daughter can't date until she's 18 years old. Just for the sake of these examples. That's right. My daughters are still not allowed to date. Okay, that's not true. So, in an authoritarian household, probably it's the dad who has made the rules, and the daughter, let's say, comes, she's 17 years old, and she's been asked out to the dance with Tommy, and he's a dreamboat and a really good kid. And she comes to her parents, and what happens? No, you don't date until you're 18 years old. We're not talking about this anymore. End of discussion. In an authoritarian household, the fact that the daughter could even come to the father, or it could be the mother also, but could even come to the father and ask that question already would have been a game. Because in 17 years of life, you already know the rules are really clear and you don't question the rules. Okay? Now, you'll see, like any grid, you know, you could be down here, this is like Hitler right here, right? Like the dictator down in the very corner. So there's gradations of where you would fall in this grid. But as a broad brush, that's what authoritarian family looks like. Does that make sense? Everybody's tracking with that? Anybody ever seen authoritarian parenting? Yeah, right? Okay, great. Okay, next one is this, authoritative. Authoritative parents tend to be demanding and hold high standards of their children, but they also express high levels of warmth and communication with them. These parents are active in their children's lives, provide a lot of guidance and supervision, and adequately adjust rules and requirements to fit situations and their child's personality. Okay, so you still have high standards, but you have more warmth and back and forth communication between parents and kids. So let's call her Susie comes and says, Tommy's asked me to the dance. Let's just keep using Dad here. Dad still may say, okay, well, the rule is we don't date until you're 18. This dance kind of feels like it fits in that category. But instead of that being the end of the conversation, Susie then has an opportunity to say, okay, Dad, I totally hear that, and I actually understand why you don't want me to date. But Tommy's a really good guy. It's just a dance. I actually think this would be good for me, and here's the reasons why. Okay, now Dad has the ability in this situation to still say, actually, I know that Tommy's a drug dealer and you can't date, you know? Or he could say, okay, we actually trust you, and I'm still not really interested in you dating. until you're 18, but we feel good about this, we had a good conversation, you can go to the meetings. Does that make sense? So it's not a like, oh yeah, do whatever you want. The same standards are still there, but there's actually now a warmth of a relationship where Susie feels comfortable coming to Dad to begin with to talk about this. And the ability to have a two-way communication that will help lead to a decision. And by the way, there could be other categories here that are much more serious than just dating, right? That whether it's authoritarian or authoritative, the answer is maybe just gonna be like, no, we're just not gonna do that at all. Like, so we can talk about it all day, but my job as a parent is to protect you. Does that make sense? Like, you're not going on the date with Troy. Okay, all right. Okay, next one is this, permissive. Permissive parents tend to be emotionally responsive and warm, but they do not hold many expectations or make many demands of their children. They are more lenient, flexible, and try to avoid conflict. Okay, so on the graph here you see they're really responsive to the needs of their kids, but they're not very demanding. So the permissive parent might be like, Susie, you want to go with Tommy? Yeah, you can go with Tommy. You know what, actually, you guys want to come over here first and you can have some drinks here at the house if you want, because it's safer for you to do it here at the house than, at the party, at the dance. Do they drink in Kansas? Okay, I'm not suggesting you should let your kids drink, I'm just saying, like, pretty sure that's, okay. So this is like, sometimes the parent that wants to be the cool parent, the one that wants to be liked by their kids more than they want to actually uphold expectations. And so, and by the way, people end up in the permissive category for lots of different reasons. Sometimes permissive parents grew up down here. And they're like, that was horrific. I never had a voice ever. So I'm never gonna let my kids do that. As a matter of fact, we actually, in some ways, see a whole generation of kids who kind of grew up in this more permissive place come out of kids of the silent generation. So the baby boomers all of a sudden are like, hey, we don't want our kids to not be able to do this, so we want to let them do everything. So I don't know where parenting is today. It's probably all over the place. But you see how it can shift really easily. And often that has a lot to do with kind of how you were raised and what's going on. Okay, and then the last one is this. Neglectful parent. The neglectful or uninvolved are more disconnected, if not withdrawn from their children. They may not know the names of their children's friends or teachers, for example, and are generally minimally involved in their children's lives outside of the home. So I'm just gonna take a flyer here and say, probably you're not showing up if you're in this category. So way to go. I'm hoping none of you are neglectful parents. You probably have something better to do than come to a parenting seminar. But these are the parents that are just really checked out and disconnected from their kids. And honestly, most of the time when you're down here in this category, there's probably some trauma going on in your life that has led you to be here. So part of me wants to say okay, it's not gonna be too surprising which box I think is the most healthiest and which the surveys found. But part of me wants to say this category right here is where the church should be most compassionate. Because this is the category that actually needs the most help, because they probably landed here, not because this is what they ever dreamed of. I don't know any parent that's like, man, I hope someday I get to be a parent and not care what my kids do. But I know a lot of parents who have found themselves in this place who are barely treading water. Does that make sense? So I guess with a pastor's heart, I had to come up with a spin. Because otherwise, what's the point? Who wants to be a neglectful parent? The example in this would be Susie wants to go to the dance with Tommy, and mom and dad aren't even around to ask. Maybe they're finding out later that Susie's pregnant, and they're like, "Who's Tommy? We didn't even know him." Okay, kids don't do that stuff here either, though, right? To get pregnant. Right? Okay, so let me just show you these four categories one more time, and then I'm going to have you do a little exercise. This is just to to reinforce what the 4 different ones are, I think, for me at least, it's helpful to just kind of have the big rocks on this. So the authoritarian, it's got high standards, but low warmth. Does that make sense when I say low warmth? Like you walk into the room and it actually feels cold. Have you ever experienced people like that? That you're like, whoa, something feels kind of weird here. Versus other people's houses you walk into and you're like, man, I just feel like I'm at home and I've never met you before. So in some ways, cold, like high warmth and low warmth, in some ways is subjective, but I think all of us can feel what that looks like. And what that is, hey, I feel warmth between you because I feel relationally connected to you. Okay, so authoritarian, high standards, low warmth, one-way communication. Parents tell the kids what to do. Authoritative, high standards, high warmth, and high communication. Standards are still high, but now there's actually a lot of warmth. We feel close, we feel connected, and we communicate really well. Permissive, you got the low standards, you got the high warmth. Kids might feel like, yeah, I know my parents really love me, I just don't really know what I'm supposed to do. It's not always the safest place for a kid to grow up. And they're conflict avoidant. Right? Because who wants to have a conflict because you might not like me if we have a conflict? But you guys don't do conflict in your marriages, right? It's a lot easier that way. That was sarcasm. Okay. And then the last one, just low standards, low warmth, and disengaged. All right, so do those 4 categories kind of make sense to you? Before I have you do this exercise, let me just say one last thing about the authoritarian and authoritative. What's not being built into this model is the developmental stages of your kids. And so anybody who's raised kids, you know that in some ways, the younger your kids are, the more authoritarian you have to be. Like, you're not having a conversation with your 3-year-old about whether they can play in traffic, right? They just can't. And that as they get older, they get more freedom. So that's not necessarily what this was measuring, but I just want to say that because that's true, is all of us as parents should be much more firm with our kids when they're really young and much more black and white, and then as they get older, begin to release more control so that they, at some point, can actually leave the nest and not need you to tell them. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. If you have something you can write on, if not, you can just imagine this in your head, or you can write on your napkin right there. If you can write this down, just make a little quadrant, or if you can't, I just want you to talk to your spouse about this for a second, whoever you're with. And what I'd love for you to do is, oh wait, sorry, before I give you that, this is a great quote. Wait, which one do you think is the best one? Okay, fine. They found the parents who have warm and kind relationships with their children were more likely than others to pass on their religion and transmit similar levels of religious belief. They also found that parents who engaged in religious activities with their children when they were young were more likely to have adult children who were similarly religious. Okay, so it came across really clearly that the authoritative model of parenting was the one that was most effective, not just in passing on the faith, which is what this was measuring for, but in other studies they found that the consistently authoritative parenting is the most effective and beneficial for all the markers that we look for in kids. So whether that's happiness, whether it's, often the test will look for smoking and drinking and other kinds of behaviors. All those things actually look better for those kids who are growing up in authoritative. Okay, so here's the exercise I want you to do. Just picture this box, and I would like for you to say where you would put yourself as a parent. And so here's the exercise. Again, if you can draw it out, it'd be easier, but if you don't have to, this is just like a pretty simple box right here. So I want you to think about, where do you think, just be honest, I'm not gonna quiz you guys on this or look over your shoulders. Where would you put yourself on this chart? And depending on what your personality is, you can decide how close to whatever the middle you are, how far hard at the edges you are. So what I'd like for you to do is just take a second and think about where would you put yourself, and then where would you put your spouse? You got this? Okay. So I want you to do that first. Think about, so each of you are, so Wendy's going to pick where she put herself and where she thinks I would go on this. And then I want you to compare that with each other. Okay? And if you're not here with your spouse, that's fine. You can just go ahead and say where you think they would be. So just take a second and do that. Does that make sense? You're opposite. That is often. Just out of curiosity, were you guys in agreement for the most part on where you put each other, or just introduce conflict into your areas? Are you? Okay. Here's what I want you to do. This is the last part of the exercise I'm going to have you do. Don't worry. I'd love you now to add into your mental picture or on your paper what your family of origin, like where your family growing up, where they live. Does that make sense? Okay, let me just ask you this. How many of you are in the same category that your parents were, that you grew up in? Would put yourself in the same category, roughly? How many of you would put yourself in a different category? Okay. Okay, so obviously I actually think this would be worth going back to be honest. Because it's just a simple graph, but I think it represents a lot, both in how the Lord's made you, how the Lord's made your spouse, where you both came from, how you were imprinted, and how you think about this. But I think it's huge that we actually think about, okay, how did Jesus, obviously he wasn't a parent in the way that we're parents, but how did Jesus live his life here on earth? Well, did he have standards? Did he compromise his standards ever? Never did. But did he just come down and like, okay, this is the way it is. You guys get this together, and I'll see you later. No, was he responsive? He absolutely was responsive. And so in some ways, this authoritative model of parenting actually represents, I believe, the heart of God, which is uncompromising truth, yet also uncompromising love. And how this becomes really practical is, I believe wholeheartedly that there's going to be things you have to walk through with your kids that you probably never imagined you would, or you just didn't see coming. But if your kids know that they're in a place where there are actually standards, and they know what the rules are, and they know that mom and dad actually love them and have some things in place, and they know that it's safe to talk about things, then man, you can navigate just about anything. And by the way, I've been doing ministry for 21 years at Cherry Creek, and I've walked through some really hard things with families, and some really great families that they're doing this to the best of their ability, and yet their kids still struggle with sin and struggle with really hard things. But to have a family that's struggling, that their kids actually still know that they're loved, and that they have a place where they can actually speak, it is really life-changing. And the Lord wired Wendy and I really differently. So while I think our parenting was up in here, Wendy would lean more towards the authoritarian, and I'd probably lean more towards the permissive, because of our personalities. So some of that is actually okay that the Lord's brought us together and we can lean on each other. There were times when Wendy needed to be like, it is actually a big deal. We can be a little firmer on that. And there were times when I was like, okay, we're probably okay. We probably can just take a breath here and pray for the kids instead of actually confronting them, right? The other thing I would say is, I think this is the best place to be as a parent. I want you guys to be here. The longer you're a parent, the easier it is to get tired of being a parent. And what happens when you get tired of being a parent is you start to either slipping this way or slipping down this way. Oh my gosh, I've been doing this for like 15 years. Fine, just do whatever you want. That's why the last kids are such a mess, right? That's me, by the way. Okay, I'm tired of having conversations. I mean, I felt like this before. Oh my gosh, how many times have I told you, you can't do this? You're not doing it, we're done, no conversation. Okay, so I'm just saying, to stay here actually requires prayer, community, and a desire to continue to do this well until your kids. I mean, I don't think we ever stop being parents, but the intensive part of parenting is really those 18 years or so that they're in the house, right? And so it actually takes a lot to try and stay in this place and especially if you grew up in one of these two places, then you're just going to naturally fall towards that. Okay. Enough about parenting styles. Are you guys tracking though on why this is a big deal? And to me, it's just as helpful when I see guys like Christian Smith go out and do a bunch of research and come back and you're like, oh, this sure seems like what Scripture talks about how we should be parents. And now I have some different language to put around it. And like, that's weird that the biblical way actually seems to be the most effective way to raise kids. So you know, our job as pastors isn't to say just do these 5 things and your kids will be perfect. But it certainly is to say the Lord actually knows us and loves us and has laid out some stuff that if we follow is going to be better than if we don't follow. Right? I can guarantee that if you don't pay attention to your kids, don't ever bring them to church, and you're in this category right here, probably your kids are going to turn up and really walk through some tough stuff. If you're up in this category and you do everything perfectly, your kids may still walk through some tough stuff. But that's not just a guarantee. Okay, all right, I'm preaching now. Parents' religiosity. The more important religion is to parents, the more parents attend religious services, the more important religion becomes for their children, and the more their children attend religious services, even years after they no longer live with their parents. Okay, so this is the no duh piece of it. If you go to church all the time and your kids come with you to church all the time, guess what? It's much more likely that they're going to go to church when they have their own kids and when they're out of the house. And I can tell you from 21 years at Cherry Creek that the single greatest indicator of how a kid was going to do and whether he would be connected to the church, he or she would be connected to the church after he graduated, was whether I saw their family in church every Sunday. So I've gotten to walk with a lot of kids whose families never came to church, and the Lord did amazing things in their lives. So I'm not going to keep giving caveats on this. The truth is the Lord can work however He wants to work. But if we're talking about the way that He's designed the faith to be passed down, the way He's made it to work, part of that is just showing up. And when you say, this is part of our life, this is just part of the regular rhythm of our life, this isn't just something we show up for when it's Christmas or Easter, but this is just what we do, then your kids just go, this is what we do. And often when kids start having teenagers and they're like, I don't want to go to church, or the kids at youth group are mean, or they're exclusive, or whatever. I don't know what kids sounds like that. That's what they sound like in my head when they talk like that. Just got an email the other day from a kid who's in a small group that was like, there are kids in a small, can I be in a different small group? It's like, man, I've walked this before. Just go to church and just stay where you are. And then we'll have hard conversations about the things that are hard. So I'm not suggesting don't deal with stuff, but if you just do that with your kids, then they don't even feel the freedom to be like, I'm not going to church anymore, because they know that you're not really committed anymore. But if they do, this is just part of our life, then they're like, hey, I don't like this. Okay, let's talk about it. Let's figure out how we can deal with that. Okay. Verbally communicating faith. Okay, so parents' religiosity, I think I probably hammered that already going through. But if you live out your faith, that's a good chance your kids are going to live out their faith. So, which, by the way, let me give just one more permission here. Your marriage is, and being able to spend time focusing on your marriage is one of the greatest gifts that you can give to your kids. Because if they actually want to see mom and dad love Jesus and love each other, well, mom and dad probably need some time to actually love Jesus and love each other, right? And so, I feel like often when I say are things that everyone's like, yeah, that totally, no way, of course, our spouse relationship should be the most important relationship. But most of us often get in places where we're just like, kids are so demanding that we stop doing that altogether. So we may believe something, but then if you were to look from the outside, you're like, I don't know if they believe that, because they're just at their kids' sporting events all the time. They don't actually ever intentionally take time to be together. So I just want to give you permission to do that. Okay, verbally communicating the faith. This was important too. How many of you have heard this quote from St. Francis of Assisi before? Preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. Okay, this is used to be really huge with young adults. They were totally all into this because they were so sick of the church being hypocritical. So they're like, yeah, just preach the gospel at all times. We don't need to use words. This is what I say. Preach the gospel at all times. It's necessary to use words. Here's the great part. St. Francis never even said this. This is the epitome of the internet age. Someone took some little piece of something he said when he was preaching to his congregation and was like, hey, that sounds kind of cool. And I'm kind of sick of people telling me what to do. Let's just all be cool with each other and live out our lives. So, should your actions match your faith? Yeah, okay, so if you're saying all the right words and you're beating your kids, there's a problem, right? So I hope that that's obvious. That if you have a relationship with Jesus, it actually should be changing your life in every aspect of it. But your kids need to hear you talk about the faith. And they won't understand the gospel apart from you using words in conjunction with your actions. So I made a big deal about you having a home that feels warm. That's the actions that go along with your faith. But you need to be able to talk about it. And that's what they found in these studies as well, is that parents who talk about their faith are actually more likely to have kids who follow along in their footsteps. It said this: by contrast, when parents talk naturally and substantively about religion and its place in life throughout the week, that effectively indicates to children that, in the mix of life's many priorities and values, this stuff matters a lot. And that raises the stakes for children's decisions about their own future religious commitments. Okay, so look, kids get compartmentalization. They get like, oh, that person says this here, but then it doesn't really matter in other places, so that's the place I need to perform. So they get this in school, they get it in sports and extracurricular activities. All of us are like that a little bit. Oh, if I just perform in this place this way, then I'll be okay, but once I'm out of that, I don't need to do that anymore. So, unfortunately, church can be a performative experience really easily. We show up at church on Sunday, we're dressed a certain way, mom's really mad if we don't look nice, but then our family never talks about anything afterwards. So this may be a great believing family that actually is following Jesus and living that out, but they never talk about it, and so it just easily builds into, oh, this is just a performance we do on Sundays. But is it really a real thing? So when all of a sudden, conversations about faith can break into every part of life. Okay, we're about to head to the game. Why don't we just say a prayer to ask the Lord to help us to glorify Him in what we do tonight? Or, oh, we're having an argument about whatever just happened. Okay, let's take some time to talk about this, and let's talk about what forgiveness really looks like. And look at how Jesus forgave us even when we were a mess. Do you see what I'm saying here? Like, I think sometimes as parents, we get scared of talking about the faith with our kids during the week. Because we feel like it has to be polished and like, oh, the way we do this is we have a family worship time. And like I get around and I sing the catechism songs in Latin to my kids, like man, we never did that in my family. And I'm a pastor. But we did talk about Jesus, and especially when things came up. And we took opportunities to pray. We had regular intervals. We prayed around meals and at night and stuff like that. The easy place to put it in, I think they're really good to be regular rituals in your lives. But then when things were hard or girls were going through difficult times, we talked about where's the Lord in the midst of this. Any of us can do that. It doesn't have to be some pre-planned huge Bible study that we do with our kids. As a matter of fact, sometimes that just builds into the performative part. So I'm not saying if you're doing great Bible studies, do that with your kids. But I'm just saying, part of what you need to do is just talk about the faith like it's a natural thing, because it is. Okay, one more thing on this. Parents not talking about religion other than during scheduled religious times reinforces that compartmentalization. But when parents discuss religion with children during the week, it decompartmentalizes and desegregates religion. And the more naturally and regularly religion is talked about, the more normally it becomes a significant part of the world of the conversation participants. So when you talk about Jesus as if he's real during the week, your kids actually believe he's real. And it changes things. Look, when Clara was born, at about 3 months in, we realized she's not meeting many of her benchmarks. And at 6 months in, it was really clear she wasn't meeting any of the benchmarks. And that kind of kicked off a at least year-long process of all kinds of testing and all the stuff. And early on in Clara's little life, there were no answers. And it actually wasn't until probably 10 years later that we did genetic testing again and found out what was going on with her. And Addie and Greta were 5 years old around 5 years old, Clara was born. And so they're watching all this as it plays out. Right, so it's like first few months, whatever, they have no idea. They just love their baby sister, kind of big head and it's not smiling yet, but as things go, we're going to the hospital, we're doing all these kinds of tests, and they're watching all this happen, and we could have just been like, it's cool, girls, we got this, everything's gonna be okay. We're not gonna talk about this this hard. But we would have missed an opportunity to invite Addie and Greta into the things that Wendy and I were wrestling as we were going, how do we deal with a daughter who was born not normal? This wasn't the plan we were looking for. And it caused us, obviously, to dig into all kinds of questions about God's sovereignty. And, which, by the way, was some of the richest diving we've ever had to do in our lives. Because it wasn't just like out here, it was like right here. And so we sat down with our girls. I really should give, I get no credit for anything other than Mary and Wendy, because really Wendy's the one that had this conversation with them. But I was there. And we sat them down and we read Psalm 139. It talks about us being knit together in our mother's womb. And when he asked the girls, she said, did God's hand slip when he was knitting Clara? Did he drop a stitch? And we were like, no. Okay, so the answer is no. No. We had the opportunity to talk to them about God's sovereignty and his loving care. And at a 5-year-old level, just the hard and broken things of the world. And that set for Eddie and Greta, Claire's still their sister, and they've walked this journey with her, and her presence in their lives has changed and transformed who they are as human beings in ways we could have never done. But now they actually have some language. This was the first conversation, but we had others, obviously. But they have language around what does it mean to actually serve a God who's present in our lives when things are really hard. And so if we don't take those opportunities to actually talk to our kids about where Jesus is and wrestle with that with them. And when they're young, you just tell them. You don't have to. You just tell them what's true. And as they get older, you begin to ask questions. And you give them opportunities to actually wrestle with these truths themselves. Okay. Last piece is this, the role of the church. The last factor parents said was particularly important about congregations was community. Parents described the importance of the congregational community as being different from school and other extracurricular activities. So this is the last thing they found, was just that a church community actually made a difference in the lives of kids, and that it actually looked different than other communities that these kids were part of. And so why I believe this is true is because the church actually represents the family of God. John 1:12 says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God." And Ephesians says this, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God." You have this beautiful thing that happens, especially in the New Testament. It becomes really clear that the family goes beyond just the nuclear family, but now all of a sudden the family becomes all those who belong to Christ. And so the church becomes this crazy place that actually is a family for those who have great parents and for those who have no parents. That the church is actually the place where God wants to see his people developed and molded and transformed into his image. So I'm not going to back off on saying that as parents, you have the biggest influence on your kids. That's unquestionable. But as a church, you have an unbelievable opportunity to build into the lives of each other's kids. Hebrews says this, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." So what does he make really clear here? One, don't neglect to meet together. Go to church. Get together outside of church. Be together. You can't encourage each other. You can't build each other up if you're not together. You're not spending time together. And it actually is the role, and I think the beautiful place of the church to be a place where family can be bigger than it is just by yourself. And I know back home that sometimes some of the circles that we swim in, sometimes the temptation is to say like, yeah, we're going to do this in our family, we're going to take control, we're going to be the spiritual leaders in our family, and I actually was just talking with the family, you don't know them, so I can throw them under the bus. I was just talking to the family the other day that I hadn't seen in a long time, and they were telling me about how great they're homeschooling their kids and how great everything was, and they've got this great property they just bought, and their kids can run and be free. And I said, I just asked, I was like, so how are things going with church? I just assumed they were going somewhere else. And they just said, oh, we're just not really going right now. And it broke my heart because
Anybody dying?
there's probably lots of reasons why they weren't at church. But part of it was they just bought into this, like, why do we need anything besides our family? We're doing our devotion times. We've got this great plot of land where our kids can roam free and live their best lives. And I thought, that's actually just not how we were designed to be. And as a youth pastor, I will tell you that the greatest impact that I get to have as a youth pastor is coming alongside a kid whose parents have been telling them all their lives something that's true, and then I get to say it for one time, and they're like, Mom, Dad, guess what Chris just shared? Parents are like, what the heck? You didn't say that. So we actually, I just know that it's true. Like, we just need other adults in our kids' lives. The Fuller Institute for Youth came out with a study a bunch of years ago called Sticky Faith, and one of the things they found was that the kids who do well need 5 adults in their lives outside of their family. And that's part of what church is designed to be, is you show up and your kids actually know other adults and other parents. Okay. The last thing is Deuteronomy 6:4-5. Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Right after this passage, he goes into details on how do you actually do this. And if you want to hear that, you have to come hear me preach tomorrow in church. That was a shameless plug. Is that okay to do that, Stephen? But for real, I'm going to talk about Deuteronomy 6 tomorrow. In some ways, it is the clearest blueprint on how you pass this on. Let me just end with one more illustration. This is Addie and Greta again. There's Addie, there's Greta. This is a place called the Lost Coast Trail in Northern California. There's a section of the Interstate 1, PCH, that actually cuts inland away from the coast for about 50 miles. And there's a 25-mile stretch that you can backpack called the Lost Coast Trail that's just like out there in the middle of nowhere. And when way before kids, Wendy and I had an opportunity to go to Africa on a mission trip, and there was an older couple, actually an older guy, who was telling us about how when his kids turned 13, they tried to do a special trip with him. And I was like, that sounds cool. Somehow, 20 years later, when we actually had 13-year-olds ourselves, we were like, I want to do that. And so we planned this trip. So it was me and the girls. Wendy stayed home with Clara, and we backpacked the Lost Coast Trail. And this isn't just an opportunity for me to show a picture that I think is kind of cool and to brag about my family, but it's an opportunity to actually talk about how I actually got to watch some of this play out in my own girls' lives. So we're out on the trail. Sunday comes around, and we're hiking. We're just backpacking on the sand. So if you've ever been backpacking or hiking before, there's just lots of time to talk because there's not much else to do, and when you're tired, then it's even more helpful to talk. And so we're hiking along the sand. It's Sunday morning. The sun's come up, and one of the girls says, "Hey, it's Sunday. We should do church." I was like, "That's a great idea. Let's do church. We'll have our own little church service." And so we do that, and here's what happened. We actually did every main element that our church service does, because Addie and Greta grew up going to church every Sunday. And so we had the introduction, the call to worship. We sang the doxology. There was the benediction at the end. You know, they had the scripture reading. So, and all of it was like, you know, pretty loosey-goosey, right? But I remember afterwards, as we kept hiking, just thinking, what an amazing gift that the Lord used just the ordinary things that happen in our life. We got to be a part of a church where people in our church loved our kids really well, so they loved going to church. And so Sunday came around, they're like, well, it's church, this is what we do. And then they remembered all the elements of the service, not because as a pastor I quizzed them on those things, but because they were just part of their life. And they wanted to do them because they actually liked that part of their life. And by the way, because I wasn't like, hey guys, it's Sunday morning, time for church. You know, it was like, they just remembered and they did it. And now, look, Addie and Greta are sinners saved by grace. But they're walking with the Lord still. And they're both off in college, and guess what? They both found churches to get plugged into. And they're actually not just showing up at church, but they're actually looking for ways that they can get plugged in and serve Him. So everybody's got different stories. So the point of this is, you know, the danger I share any of the details of my own story is, again, that somehow, like, it just makes me like, oh, of course he can do that, he's a pastor or whatever. But of course you're not seeing all the hard things that we walk through as well. But the beauty of story is to say, look, this is what we do as Christians. I looked at other people who went before me, and I mean, even the simple example of like, hey, take your kids on a 13-year journey. Well, that sounds like a great idea, I'm going to do that. Or, hey, you should bless your kids before they go to bed every night. Oh, that's a good idea, you can do that? How do you do that? Well, just pick a blessing out of Scripture and say it. Okay, I'm going to do that every night. Well, those things happen because you're part of a community, and life's change, and the faith is passed down because you live out that faith authentically. You have it become a normal part of your life. And you create a warm and firm place for your kids to grow up. Okay. Let me pray, and then I'd love to just open it up for some Q&A. And here's the truth is, Andrew and Stephen and Rem are your pastors. They know you. I've met a few of you just because I've come out here before. But they're the ones that are walking with you, and they actually have an incredible amount of wisdom. But the gift of getting to do ministry for a long time and being in a relationship is that we can share the gifts we have and be able to encourage each other. So let me pray, and then if you have questions, feel free to ask. But also, of course, you have pastors who love you and want to actually walk through life with you, not just answer questions. Okay, let me pray. So Lord, we covered a lot of stuff tonight, and I recognize that the danger could be that I just gave a grid of where we all need to be, and that if we just follow that perfectly, then our kids will turn out well, and there will be no problems. And we know that's not true. So I just ask, Lord, that you would help apply the things that were most helpful and most needed to be heard tonight, and that by the power of your Spirit, you would enable us to be parents who love our kids well, and who point them to you. And Lord, I take such incredible comfort in knowing that you know the imperfect parent that I am, you know the imperfect parents that we are, and you know how much we love our kids, and yet you love them even more than we do. And so we ask that you would use us and empower us to be the best possible parents we can be. And Lord, we ask that you would be the one that loves and cares for our kids, and draws them to yourself, and prepares a life for them of following you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I would love to just open up the floor if you have any questions at all that came up from what we were talking about, or anything else. Any questions that came up?
So one observation that me and my wife had is that with a family that has, you know, they talked their faith, they went to church, they lived the life of being in church.
Yep.
What caused some kids to turn away from that so drastically? Some kids in the family have turned completely away, and some still have that faith. But what do you think would cause that departure from?
That is such a great question, and you know, you serve in a church for a long time, and that's certainly been my experience over the years. So let me answer it two ways. I'm going to try and answer it as honestly as I can. One way would be this. Let me start here. Is sin is actually really destructive and powerful. And I think a true understanding of the gospel is one that treats sin as destructive and terrible as it is. And if that's true, it means that even if we do our best to raise our kids, you know, they still get to make choices. And they really can be dragged away by sin. Now what I want to be clear on is, I'm not talking about a salvation issue. That can be complicated too, but I really believe, look, if a kid's made a decision, the Lord's going to hold him, and that's different than the path that they're walking. But from what we can see, we certainly have plenty of examples of like, wow, it sure seemed like things were good there. So why are Susie and Billy and Jimmy all okay, but Johnny is like a disaster and has completely walked away from the faith and is living his own thing and living it up, right? Yeah, so the first way to answer this, I actually believe that sin is powerful. I think there's a real enemy that wants to destroy us. And I'm walking that journey with families right now. And the families that I see walking that journey best are still in relationship with their kids. So I know, I don't know what the sexuality stuff is like out here, but I'm walking with a family whose son came out as gay after high school, has gotten married to a much older guy. Like, so they're like walking through all of this, and are heartbroken about it for their son. And yet they have not given up hope that the Lord has abandoned him or is not part of his life, their lives. So there's a lot of time spent in prayer, and they haven't cut off a relationship with their son. And so I know, like, obviously it could just be opening a can of worms here, but I know that that's really difficult. Is like, how do you walk when somebody's being destructive in their life, whether it's a sexuality thing or drinking or drugs or promiscuity or like whatever that category might be? How do you actually walk that with them? But to remain in a place that says, I love you, we're not going to support you in what's happening, but we're not leaving your life. Okay, so that makes sense. So one, I just actually think sin is really terrible. And sometimes because we get that Jesus has overcome sin, we can sometimes minimize how great the cost was for him to do that and how terrible sin can be. The second is I just have a really high view of depravity and of what can happen behind closed doors that we don't always see. And so I just think, man, Wendy and I tried to be good parents. Like, I think we've actually tried intentionally to be good parents, and yet our girls, I'm certain, are carrying crap from us. Because we're carrying crap from our own parents that we maybe didn't even realize that we're taking into it. So that could be as easy and simple as like insecurities maybe we brought into things, or not stepping into things in the way the Lord maybe has called me to at times, and maybe that affected my girls. So that makes sense. So part of me is like, oh man, I always want to believe the best for people, and working with youth is like, I always want to believe the best in them, but I'm always like, you could be lying right through your teeth to me right now, and that's equally possible. And so sometimes I just think, I don't know what might have gone on in the family, and it's completely unhelpful to be like, oh, you must have been really terrible to that kid, that's why they rebelled, because that doesn't seem to be true all the time. But sometimes kids really struggle because there's more going on that we just don't see. So does that kind of answer your question? I mean, it's heartbreaking to be really honest. I mean, I think that's probably the hardest thing is so as a family, you pour into your kids and to have them walk away. I can't tell you how many grandparents I talk to at our church who have got kids and grandkids who aren't walking with the Lord at all, and they're heartbroken about it. But I think the story is never over, and so I think that's where I don't lose hope. Because I just think, okay, number one, Jesus is never done pursuing people, and number two, I guess I've had the benefit of doing ministry for a long enough time that some choices kids made when they were in high school that I was like, oh my gosh, how are they ever going to recover from this? 10 years later, they're like parents, and I'm like, oh wow, time actually does take a long time. And there is actually opportunities for redemption. So, thanks, that's a great question. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, what would be your advice for someone as a kid that you take an authoritative approach consecutively and find yourself falling into authoritarian really fast?
Totally, yeah. So I just think the beginning is, okay, so confession time. I'm pretty low-key and chill and go with the flow. It's probably why I've been able to be a youth pastor for middle schoolers for as long as I have. But if you push the right buttons in me, I jump down into that authoritarian place really quick. So I get that, that instinct is in me so much to just okay, I'm done. It's my way or the highway. And I know I'm right, and usually I am right when I get to that place, right? You're an idiot kid, and I'm the one that knows what's going on, and let me fix this for you. So I would say, number one, just being aware of okay, what's actually going on inside of me that feels the need for control right now? Because I think often we go to that authoritarian place because we think, if I don't lay down the law right now, I'm going to lose control of the situation. But the lie in all that is, you may not lose control of the situation, but you're losing the relationship when you do that. And so, practically what does that look like? Is you and your spouse talk and you just say okay, how do we navigate this? Because my natural bent is to just go straight here, and that's how I was raised, and that's aren't those the hardest things to change in our life? Those things that are just kind of imprinted on us? It's not like me just saying, hey, you shouldn't do that. You're oh great, I won't do that forever again. No, it's oh crud, now we gotta figure out how to do this. I just think it's just having people in your life that can help walk that with you. The last thing I would say is this, that there's nothing more powerful in your kids' lives than asking them for forgiveness. And I gotta tell you, when you go to your kid, you might not say, hey, what you did was right. It probably was still wrong. Right? But when you can go to your kid, after the fact, when you realize oh man, I just came down much harder than I should have. I didn't mean to, and now I've realized it. When you go back to them and you just say, hey, I'm really sorry. I was really frustrated that you did this, but that was wrong of me to come down so hard on you. Or whatever that might be. Sometimes as parents, we think that's like waving the flag of surrender. We're oh, we can't do that because then they won't think that, this was true. But instead what that does is it actually, again, it creates warmth in your relationship that allows your kids to go, oh, Dad messes up sometimes too, and now I actually can trust him more. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I just think, man, that is so huge that we recognize that we're given the ability to go to our kids and ask for forgiveness. And asking forgiveness is not compromising. It's actually just being honest about our own shortcomings. That's a great question. Thanks. Anything else? Yeah, Stephen?
Yeah, we've got a lot of young kids in our church. So what would you say to us parents whose kids are going to be teenagers?
Yes.
What do you do to prepare for that?
Yes.
And specifically the difference between being able to make your kid do something
Yes.
and starting to see that ability disappear.
Yes.
What words of wisdom do you have?
Yeah. Good luck. Just kidding. No, that's great because you just have to imagine this. I mean, I talked about this earlier. Like when you start with your kids, you have full control, like high authority. You tell them what to do, and as they grow older, you should release more and more of that control and give them opportunities to make decisions on their own. And that's what happens around those middle school years. And I mean, it's crazy. You just kind of watch it happen. Part of what happens is your kids go from black and white thinkers to abstract thinkers. So a black and white thinker, it's a lot easier to just be like, you do this because I said to do this. And they're like, okay, that makes sense, I'll do that. And you're my authority and I'm gonna obey you. And as they go into the middle school years, they begin to actually start to wrestle with abstract thoughts. And they also begin to try and figure out, who am I apart from just my parents? So when they're younger, they're you. They're just an extension of you, and that's a really beautiful thing. And so I would just say, as your kids begin to enter into those years, one, be ready to start changing your parenting style with them. I think too often what happens is we're so used to doing things one way. I mean, for us with our girls, obedience was a really big deal when they were young. Like, we tell you to do something, you obey. But because we want you to obey God, like, we want that. So, but as they got older, like that, you don't tell a 17-year-old, you just need to obey, like that actually, no, that we actually need to have a conversation about this now. And so being able to adjust your parenting from, I just tell you everything to do and you just do it, to begin to open up a little bit and look for places where you can begin to give your kids some freedom. So again, obviously that's different for every family, but you're beginning to actually give your kids opportunities to fail on their own. And the danger is we don't want our kids to ever fail, and so we keep telling them what to do, and we try and protect them so that they won't ever fail, and then they never learn because and then often they just end up rebelling. And so I would say, one, be ready to just start adjusting your parenting a little bit and recognize like, oh, we're kind of at a different stage. Okay, Mom, Dad, we need to talk a little bit here and figure out like, what do we do now? Because this is a little bit different. And beginning to give them opportunities to actually make some decisions on their own. So obviously, again, like, we're not going to like put out the tequila bottle and let you just drink. Your job is still to protect your kids, but you didn't get your homework in on time? Okay, let's talk about that. What happened? Not, hey, I'm going to go call your teacher and let's make sure we get this taken care of and we're going to fix this for you and I'm never going to let this happen. I'm going to ask you every second of the day if you've done your homework. Does it make sense? So I know that's kind of a vague answer, but in some ways if you can just picture that idea of like going from high control to really by the time they leave the house, no control but relationship. So your goal is to have complete control of your kids when they're young because they're like little leeches when they're born, to when they leave the house, you're an advisor and companion and friend to them. And so the hope is, so we're experiencing this a little bit with our college-age daughters now. It's great to have them out of the house now. Like, most of the conflict's gone, and now when they call, they actually want to talk to us and actually want to know what we think about things, which they didn't really want to know that much when they were at home still. They were just kind of sick of us. And so I just think recognizing there's developmental stages that are really natural, and for your kid to actually be healthy, they have to separate from you. And for them to separate from you, you have to give them the ability to actually do that and say, thanks, Stephen. It's a great question.
You kind of answered it with that. I was just thinking how can it be different with each child? Not really stages, but just the different personalities, how they kick back or not.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll tell you what, your friends are going to have the kids who are perfect and don't struggle with any of these things, and your kids aren't going to be like that, and it's going to be mad. I think all kids go, like, the developmental stages, like, the Lord's just hardwired us to be that way. Kids reach them in different places, but, going from black and white to abstract and some of the different questions they start asking about God and the world and trying to understand who I am apart from my parents, like, those are all really normal things. But how kids go through those stages, it absolutely looks really different. And which is why I always am really uncomfortable with someone who comes up with like the new plan for parenting. That's like, you do this and your kids are going to turn out great. And you're like, okay, that's great for, like, that worked for your two weird kids. But my kid's not like that, And so I just, look, this is why I'm so sold out on the church and I'm so sold out on community, is that we just need other people in our lives that have done this before or that are doing this right now that could just be like, oh my gosh, that happened to you too? Yeah, I feel that. That's really cool. Not to say there's nothing to be done, but sometimes we just need that. To just be like, yeah, so we're part of a small group and all their kids are like younger than our kids. So they're one of the oldest is just now going to be a senior in high school. And he's like walking through some of the same stuff our daughters just did. And we're like, yeah, totally, I get that. Yeah, I see why you feel like the worst parent in the world right now. Because we felt like that too. Guess what? It's going to be okay. When he goes away, it'll probably be much better. So just like having other people that can do that. But yeah, each kid has their own personality. Some might be more strong-willed, some might be more submissive. I think sometimes the Lord just has a sense of humor and like gives us one kid that you're like, oh, this is gonna be easy, and the next kid comes along and you're like, oh my gosh, we don't know anything. We're the worst parents ever. So, all right, maybe one more question. Yeah.
I feel kind of stuck between what's up to me and what's up to God's grace.
Yes.
How do you wrestle with that? Do you practical things, but not perfect?
That's easy. So the question was, what's up to me and what's up to God's grace in my kids' lives? And what things do I do and how do I protect against that just being performative? Is that kind of right? And I would say is, look, the Lord's giving you your kids. And he actually has given you some direction on the things that you should be doing in their lives. So maybe the question you have to ask is, am I doing these things in my kids' lives because I want other people to, because I'm worried about how my kids are going to reflect on me? Or because I just feel like this is what God's called me to do? That's not always necessarily easy to parse that out, but we begin to see that when we see how we respond when our kids, do something bad in church and someone gives us a crusty, or like a crusty look or whatever, and how we respond to that. And if all of a sudden it's like we feel crushed by those kinds of things, then we have to go, okay, is this really just about me wanting to have perfect looking kids? So maybe that's only one of the things, but look, ultimately, nothing good's going to happen in our kids' lives apart from the Lord doing it. But guess what? You're plan A for bringing about those good things. And so maybe that's a messy answer for a messy question. But I think the fact that you're even asking that actually represents the fact that you recognize, look, I can only do so much in my kids' lives. And if God is not involved in this, it doesn't matter what I do. And so I want to say, okay, be faithful. The Lord knows who you are. Man, the Lord knows that He brought up Addie and Greta and Clara in a family that loves Jesus, but is really kind of a mess. Sometimes when I'm at my worst, and I just think, what on earth? How, So there's maybe like two perfect couples here. I'm not sure which they are, but there's probably two of you who are like perfect. Oh, look, none of us are. And none of this is a surprise to the Lord. And so I really believe strongly that, look, our job is to just be faithful with what we've been given and to do our best. And to remain connected to a community that can actually help us see that. And so when I'm blinded to, oh my gosh, I'm just making my kids perform, or I'm checking out because I'm tired of doing this, I've got people around me that are saying, hey, how are you doing? How's it going? Because it actually seems like this is good. Does that make sense? All right, Stephen or Andrew, can I have one of you guys come up here and pray to close the lobby?
Thank you guys all for coming again. I hope that it was a blessing to you. I know it was a blessing to me. Chris will be here again tomorrow morning preaching here at Christ Covenant, and then I'll be down in Lincoln next week preaching the same text. So don't worry if you're down in Lincoln, we've got you guys. Yeah, it's just I hope tonight has been an encouragement to you guys that although, yes, there are things that we can work on, that we can try to do, God is at work in your families. He's given you the kids that He's given you, and He knew before you were even born that those were the kids that He was going to give you. So what I hope you take away from tonight more than anything else is keep seeking the Lord. Keep seeking the Lord in your marriage. Keep seeking the Lord with your kids. And He is faithful to bring that to fruition. So would you pray with me? Lord, I pray, would you bless these families? Would you bless these kids that are running rambunctiously through that room? And Lord, would you give us as parents strength and wisdom to know you, to love you, and to follow you, Lord, as we seek to lead the kids you've given us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all. If you have a minute to help with tables, we do need to put 4 of these tables back in this room. Thanks. And one back in that room.